Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
Good morning and welcome to the Daily Politics podcast from Politico and Sky News, where we tell you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes, largely by finding out what global news editor-in-chief Donald Trump has been saying after everyone in Westminster went to bed.
And it could be another week where comments by Donald Trump in DC head straight to Prime Minister's questions at lunchtime here. It's Wednesday, February the 5th, 2025. I'm Anne McElvoy, Executive Editor at Politico. With me is Sam Coates of Sky News. It's PMQs in a week where the domestic agenda has felt a bit light on the ground.
One of the things a successful Prime Minister and his team often do is to set the agenda, using announcements, pronouncements. And this Downing Street is a bit better than it was at the end of last year. But still, if you look this week, if you look at the morning's front pages, if you look at the kind of the way that Number 10 has been trying to set the agenda, well, Anne, can you tell from this morning's papers what Number 10 think the biggest story of the day should be?
Well, looking in front of me, it's Lucy Letby on several of the front pages and problems with NHS mental health services elsewhere. So frankly, no, Sam, it doesn't look like something that the media greedmeisters would have wanted this morning.
And I think that's a bit of an issue because we end up saying something like that a lot of the time. The government's big announcement today is actually about the funding for flood defences. Steve Reed is out on the morning round. And as it happens, I think, the amount of money that goes to flood defences has been one of the more fraught discussions behind the scenes for this government between the Treasury and the Environment Department. It's not been easy. Today's announcement is a sort of uplift in the amount of cash spent on flood defences. So it's going to be an average of 1.3 billion a year, up from just a little over 1 billion a year under the Tories, which is a decent enough uplift, though with climate change, will it be enough? And there's a common statement today. But I can't see it anywhere in the Times, the Telegraph. There's a small piece in the Guardian about it. And this is absolutely no slight on DEFRA, who did a very good job briefing people yesterday and rolling out a plan. But I just day after day, I get the impression that Number 10 isn't just that bothered about kind of in some way directing the public conversation, or more importantly, from their point of view, avoiding a vacuum. So they can't really complain when the agenda gets filled with other things, which takes us very neatly onto our first and incredibly important story today. And it's a subject that Labour absolutely, totally and definitely does not enjoy talking about. Anne, do you want to just tell us what Donald Trump has been saying overnight, and then we'll explain the repercussions for Westminster?
It's a huge curveball, Sam, from the American president, proposing in a press conference in Washington alongside Israel's leader Benjamin Netanyahu that America could, as he put it, take over the Gaza Strip, with Gazans being resettled in Egypt and Jordan, among other Arab states, and that the US would somehow administer Gaza as a massive rebuilding project inhabited by, again, as Donald Trump put it, the world's citizens and also Palestinians. The phrasing of that, of course, massively troublesome for many world leaders, including our own.
I mean, of all the pronouncements about global politics that we've had from Donald Trump, this is the one that has made my jaw drop more than any other, I have to say. It all took place standing next to a fawning Benjamin Netanyahu, and really you only had to look at the body language to see, Trump has picked a side. The US president insisted that Egypt and Jordan and other unnamed countries will, as you said, resettle Gazans from the pure demolition site left by Israel's 15-month bombing campaign. It was interesting just looking in detail at his language, because he was talking about how the US will own it and be responsible for the redevelopment. And listening to that, Anne, it did strike me that we see a Donald Trump that has many, many personas in the White House and outside. And almost incredibly, the one that we saw last night was Donald Trump, the property developer. using that language on arguably one of the globe's most sensitive subjects?
I had exactly the same thought about that language, that framing, which, of course, when you unpack it, were it to go ahead as proposed, and there'd be a lot of doubt about whether this could ever really happen in the direction he proposes, but it would mean the massive displacement of Palestinians. This kind of plan of just cleaning out the Gaza Strip on those terms has been nixed by the countries where he wants the resettlement to happen. He did sound very bullish, didn't he, on that real estate development zone kind of lingo, but there was no mention at all of a Palestinian state. And the question is that just another example of Donald Trump's bluff, or is it a serious proposal? It's certainly beneficial, Sam, to Netanyahu in the short term, because he needs to show that the war will have somehow driven Hamas out of the territory, which is not the case right now. It's opposed immediately by Saudi Arabia and other major players. It has really caused a lot of discombobulation, and it's a huge problem for Labour, isn't it? They must have kept the lights burning all night in Downing Street.
So we'll get on to Downing Street's reaction and the government's reaction in a moment, and I'm going to give you a clue, Anne. Don't expect it to be incredibly substantive. We'll see whether that evolves for Prime Minister's questions. But it's worth us dwelling on the fact that this is perhaps Labour's least favourite subject. How Labour responds to this evolving situation in the Middle East, and how it has responded all the way since October 2022 to that attack by Hamas, Israel's response, and how now Trump has intervened in this subject, is a huge, massive and thorny issue for Keir Starmer. Because, very, very bluntly, there are plenty of people in the Labour Party who think that Keir Starmer is out of step with parts of the party in the way that his instincts take him a bit closer to Israel than many of his fellow Labour Party members. It's a subject which pushed members of the shadow cabinet close to resignation in opposition, triggered resignations from the party at grassroots level and at councillor level. And it's simply... I just think this is one of those subjects where it's an emotional subject for the party, but it doesn't really have. I often don't think that Keir Starmer is a leader that particularly emotes successfully, particularly about issues that Labour care about. And this has been true all the way back over the last couple of years. And before we get on to the very latest overnight developments and how that goes down in Labour, sort of serendipitously, you actually get quite a lot of insight into precisely this subject in the new book by Gabriel Pogrund and Patrick Maguire, Getting, all about Keir Starmer, Labour and its arrival in power. And this is quite lucky timing, but Gabriel Pogrund has actually recorded for us, for this podcast, a voice note, which is his analysis of how and why Keir Starmer ended up at odds with his party on the subject of the Middle East. And here's the voice note. I'm going to play it to you. It's about 2 minutes long, which is longer than we usually do on this podcast with voice notes. But it does contain exclusive extracts from leaked WhatsApp groups involving members of the shadow cabinet, as was, and is really, really compelling. So here is Gabriel with Keir Starmer and his attitude to the Middle East and why that has caused him problems with his party.
You asked for a tale or a detail that illustrated something about Keir Starmer that we hadn't foreseen. And I must say my mind fell to a WhatsApp group which was created in the aftermath of October the 7th and populated by members of both Starmer's office as well as his shadow cabinet, David Lammy, among them. And this is a podcast scoop. We haven't reported on this elsewhere, but the conversation and the correspondence is fascinating because within days of the attacks and within days of Starmer's articulation of a very steadfast position supporting Israel, Lammy was complaining that Emily Thornberry the previous night on Newsnight was given, in his words, a real roasting, that the party needed to show more empathy. Vidya Alexson, one of Starmer's top aides now in Downing Street, similarly used that word, empathy. She said that there was a deficit of it and that Starmer needed to demonstrate more. And one of the critiques of books like ours is that they view history through the prism of advisors. And as we cast our eyes over this correspondence, we probably initially thought that it simply was a case of Morgan McSweeney or one of the more moderate Blairite aides to Starmer thwarting the aspirations of those who would have taken a softer stance on Israel-Palestine. But In conversations with those who know Starmer and those who were involved, it becomes very clear indeed that on this matter, in a way which couldn't be applied to questions of economic policy, for instance, Starmer was utterly unbending and total in his resolve. He regarded it as a moral issue, not just to stand by the Jewish state in this moment, but also to stand by the United States in that moment. And for so much of the book, we are confronted with a unknowable subject, a man whose politics did evolve, who shifts shape, who sometimes is the barrister conveying to the judge the brief that he has been handed down. But in this instance, you get a sense of the visceral Starmer, and a man who, even when Shabana Mahmood, now the Justice Secretary, was tearily explaining to him the impact that Labour's position was having, was not for the turning. Perhaps this is a concession of defeat. I don't think Patrick and I have a grand unified theory of when you get that Keir Starmer, but I think it is one of the great contradictions of him as a character in the book, which is that on some matters, he's so happy to subcontract politics and policy, but on others, utterly not so. Here comes the conviction politician, and the person who understands that essentially understands Keir Starmer, and it's not necessarily something that could be predicted, but when it's there, you feel it, and those around him feel it. And it was one of the more emotionally raw bits of the book to report upon as a result.
So that's the backstory, and what happens next?
Well, certainly I think Keir Starmer will want to be seen to be standing firm as an ally of the US and Israel. This is not a moment when he wants to start picking a fight with Donald Trump on a consequential matter of foreign policy. He's got one or two of those bubbling along anyway with the Chagos Islands, etc. But he won't want to be seen to be abandoning the cause of the Palestinian people. So many people in and close to Labour passionately champion that. And there is, as you suggested, and as we heard there from Gabriel Pogrund, there is a lot of soreness about Starmer's embrace of Israel after the dreadful events of October the 7th. And this feeling among MPs that there's a belated appreciation of the toll that military intervention has taken on Gaza, and how Keir Starmer chooses to address that now in a way that Donald Trump has forced the point, and he's forced this Palestinian issue back onto the table in his inimitable style, just at the time when a lot of leaders are still scrambling to figure out where they really want to be at the end of at least this phase of the military conflict.
Now, because it's Flood Defences Day, it's Steve Reed doing the morning round, and I suspect there's an almighty scramble to give Steve Reed just some lines to take on this to get him through, because he's going to be asked about this. Now, this is something where the government response may evolve, but right now, I think the approach of the government will be to do what it's done with quite a lot of Donald Trump stuff, and just say that it's not going to respond directly, point by point, to everything the American president says. That's sort of got them through to this point so far since Donald Trump got in, so I wouldn't expect that to change. And more broadly, Britain has a sort of position that it could retreat to, which is the UK and the G7 want a two-state solution with Israel alongside a viable Palestinian state, and I'm sure that they will retreat to that kind of slightly defensive base position if pushed. But as you say, Anne, and as your sort of analysis made clear, you know, it's very hard when you've got Keir Starmer not wanting to pick fights, but a party that does not want him to do, that will want him to push back on what the American president and Benjamin Netanyahu were saying overnight. It'll be very, very hard to square that circle. And because it's a Wednesday, he will be in the Commons chamber having to do that very job. So I think PMQs is a must watch for people who care about the Middle East and care about watching how a prime minister squares two impossible things. It's
a reminder, isn't it, that Donald Trump is always going to shoot from the lip, and it's going to demand great agility from Keir Starmer to respond to what's going to be a very different way of doing foreign policy. Another subject, Sam, from overseas that is in the news and testing the PM is the Chagos Islands. Keir Starmer is saying he's going to push ahead with a deal that's become very controversial, and actually, given the opposition also something to grab onto there seems to be a suggestion coming from the Mauritian Prime Minister, who's beginning to take up quite a position in British politics, that the original 9 billion offer to Mauritius for that British lease for Diego Garcia, the military base there, has been upped to a large extent. Some people say almost double, but the figure's rather vague and nobody will confirm what this deal is worth. So my colleague, Dan Bloom, points out in his piece in Playbook that UK officials believe any agreement is about 2 to 3 weeks away at the very least, largely because it's caught up in the many layers of the US government machine. And as we're reflecting, the US government machine is a very busy place these days.
That's back to the theme of this podcast, one of the themes of this podcast, Anne, which is talking about the Chagos Islands is something that happens when there is a vacuum not filled elsewhere. And I was very struck by some comments by a pollster yesterday that says that the issue of the Chagos Islands is actually coming up in focus groups. It's sort of spontaneously being raised by people who don't pay a lot of attention to the news as an example of Britain slightly losing control of its foreign policy, or Britain not being able to assert itself on the globe. So there might have been a view in Downing Street that this is a legalistic matter, and I think that would be driven by the Attorney General, Richard Hermer, who seems to be one of the forces behind trying to sort out this piece of legal inconvenience in international law. But actually it has very real world domestic political consequences, because it's quite an easy to understand story. A lot of money having to be shelled out by British taxpayers for something that, for a corner of the globe that they thought they used to control, right? So it is not something that can be just parked and ignored with political consequences. Right, I've said the word money, so I'm just going to move on to Rachel Reeves in a not at all inelegant segue. Look, we have talked.
It's the way you tell them, anyway.
About the challenges. I've got an eye on that clock. We can't be too graceful in our U-turns. Listen, we talked a lot about the challenges that Rachel Reeves face. Just to recap, on March the 26th, she's got something called the Spring Statement. That's when her own watchdog, the Office of Budget Responsibility, will sit in judgment on her and rule whether or not she is going to breach her fiscal rules by borrowing too much in the years to come. And since the OBR last did its assessment, things have got much trickier for Rachel Reeves, because the cost of borrowing has gone up, and that means that the cost of debt interest has gone up, and has just left her with less money to play with. There's been a very real chance that she breaches her fiscal rules, and lo and behold, on the front page of the Times today, there's discussion about whether she's going to have to raise taxes, cut spending, or in some way deal with this problem, because she says she's not going to break her fiscal rules and she'd have to take action if the OBR said that things were heading in the wrong direction. Right, so my little piece of intelligence is I've been talking to people in the markets, and they say that actually the cost of borrowing now has come off its recent highs. So if the OBR is basically doing its sampling of what it thinks the cost of borrowing is going to be and how much government's going to pay for it all in the years to come, then right now, actually, Rachel Reeves wouldn't be in breach of her fiscal rules. She's just got a little bit more breathing space because that cost of borrowing has come down. Now, if you remember, she left herself £9.9 billion of headroom, just over £9 billion of headroom. That will be slashed, but it might not disappear entirely, which in many ways will be a relief for the Chancellor, because she won't have to she's not forced to take immediate action. But the question is, if she ends up with just £1, £2, £3 billion of headroom, is she not going to have to do something anyway? Is she not going to have to squeeze the spending rise yet further, even if she doesn't break her fiscal rules? So maybe just the markets and the cost of borrowing and the yield curve going down is just a little bit better for Rachel Reeves, and so it's important to point that out. This might not be the moment of testing that it had been 3 weeks ago when the cost of everything was just.
Can I just chip in something on that, Sam? Because it always reminds me when we talk about headroom as if this was celestially decreed. This is actually the product of a way that Labour sort of set out its own fiscal discipline. It's not like an absolute figure, but once you've sort of said that this is how you're going to define it, then of course the OBR kicks in, Office of Budgetary Responsibility, and says, well, actually you hit it or you didn't. And it's so interesting to me that Rachel Reeves, I think, is really beginning to realise quite how tight, and you laid it out very well there. These are very sort of tight margins around figures of a few billion here and there to give herself any room for manoeuvre, and any room for manoeuvre, of course, for colleagues who want to do some more spending or want, as they see it, to deliver on promises that were made implicitly of where Labour would increase spending but without cutting taxation. And it's such a fine line she walks. And if you're right about this, she will breathe a huge sigh of relief because it just gets her over that very, very difficult moment that is coming, and we'll see if she's got space above her head or not.
But there are still lots of unknowns, meaning that she might end up missing it. There's the path of interest rates, Bank of England decision on Thursday. But you're right, Anne. When Rachel Reeves took the big decision to effectively copy Tory fiscal rules and cut and paste them, many of them, into the Labour playbook before the election, she did so without consulting the shadow cabinet. So on her head be it this way of doing business when it comes to budgets, and she was the one that decided to push basically the public finances to the limit, to sort of leave so little wiggle room to really to take as big a risk as she did in the October budget, a week before Donald Trump was elected president for the second time. So she was taking a gamble at a point where you knew that the global environment was risky, and all of this could come to a head this summer. And I'm just going to pick one spending issue at random. With public sector pay, she has no room for manoeuvre in these figures. Even if it comes out on the right side, she can't spend anything on anything. Labour was very generous a year ago when it came into office 6 months ago with its public sector pay deals. If it can't do the same again this summer when the public sector pay rounds are back again, could we end up facing strikes? Could we end up facing something like that slows down the economy? It's an invidious choice. And quite a lot of those choices that are the result of decisions that Rachel Reeves has made over the last year or so. And so a lot of this rests on her shoulders. So it's not all good news, but there's the bell. That's enough. We'll come back to Rachel Reeves another day. Gosh, it's a dramatic one this morning. I'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow morning. I love the ringtone, Sam.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James McElvoy.
Me, Martha Kelnick.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.